The year is 1494. Lorenzo de' Medici has just passed away. The child to inherit the Medici Bank was his son, Piero. Following some horrendous misappropriation of funds and general lack of economic knowledge, Piero just bled the bank money completely from under his ownership. Those with investment inside the bank saw this behavior and pulled out what money they could as quickly as possible. And as a result of this crazed panic out of nowhere, the Medici Bank past a point had to look at the people who had their money within them and said, "Hey, we aren't able to pay you back what you gave us to hold on to. Sorry." The people of Florence were understandably angry with the Medici as a whole. In 1495, Charles VIII of France, who was sweeping through Italy at this time, overtook Florence with relative ease since it offered almost no resistance to his forces. In the early stages of this occupation, a certain man earned King Charles's trust, enough to where the king actually left him with considerable control over the city itself. The man in question is known as Girolamo Savonarola. Before we get into that, let's cover Savonarola's origins. In his earlier years, he was obsessed with the idea of humanism and opposed the church in its current state. He saw the corruption and wanted to restore it to its former purity as he saw it. Stating he wanted to be a Knight of Christ, he went to join the Dominican order. Some sources say, oddly enough, that he went and did this because he proposed to a girl he had the hots for. She turned him down, and while he was depressed, he went off and became a monk. How about that? In the following years, there are frequent instances where he was definitely making statements in opposition to the Catholic Church. In Florence in particular, he gave sermons that all but stated the names of people within the church that he was slandering. He wasn't outright naming guys, but from what I could tell, if you were a local or had some basic knowledge of the time, it sounds as though most folks had a good idea of who or what he was referring to in his rants. His sermons typically came from the first epistle of John, which refers to people essentially straying from the core concept of Christianity as a whole, and it alludes to corruption within the system. In 1493, he stated that a new Cyrus would come over the mountains and renew the church. And when you know it, a year later, King Charles of France began his offensive on Italy and steamrolled into Florence. The fact that Savonarola supposedly foresaw this led the people of Florence to think of him as some sort of a prophet. Now, Florence didn't offer resistance, but it still didn't outright say that they were allied with Charles as he approached, possibly due to the Medici councilmen and politicians in control. As a result, Charles just began sacking Tuscan structures in the countryside and so forth. To quickly make up for this, Piero and the remaining Medici were forcibly removed by mobs, driven out of the city, and Savonarola went to welcome Charles, apologizing that they hadn't sided with him sooner. After a brief occupation, Charles seemed convinced that Savonarola was on his side and left him with a considerable amount of power over the city. Medici-appointed folk were ousted from power, and they were replaced by folks more in line with Savonarola's views. These people were known as the Frateschi. The initial legal changes weren't bad at all. Exiles and bannings of the city from the past were all wiped clean, complete clean slate. Privileges and such that were held by very distinctive class lines were allowed to more of the populace, such as certain voting or trade rights. Savonarola's sermons, though, grew a little excessive. He saw Charles's offensive as an embodiment of a new great flood, for example, and that allying with him would give the people of Florence a place on the ark into the new world. He foresaw Charles's arrival, and he began to say that he also foresaw other things, like Lorenzo and Pope Innocent's death. I mean, he just neglected to tell anyone, of course. He also said that God told him that Florence would be the new Jerusalem of the world. Rodrigo, or Pope Alexander VI at this point, called for all of his allies, including Florence, to band against Charles. Savonarola's appointed followers within the government flatly refused to do this. Prior to this point, Alexander was just laughing to himself about Savonarola's rants because he just seemed harmless and like that crazy guy that nobody ever listens to, but now he was openly opposing him, and this understandably made him angry. The two exchanged letters, no doubt strongly worded, and at one point, Savonarola said he had a good reason to take up opposition to Alexander. When pressed on why, he simply mailed the Pope a copy of the Book of Revelations, which basically covered his sermons as a whole. Alexander demanded that Savonarola appear before him in Rome, but he refused, stating that he feared the Pope would kill him en route. In response to this, Alexander told Savonarola he was no longer allowed to preach or give sermons. Finally, Savonarola agreed. Due to the silence, however, his pull and clout as well as public image began to wane. So he decided it was time to ignore the Pope's orders. He began offering more vitriol-filled sermons, angrier than ever, against the Pope and everyone who supported him, in an attempt to regain the attention he previously held so tightly. And the focus of this rage was directed towards everyone who was clinging to the old, corrupt ways, saying that cleansing was necessary and imminent. This eventually led to the Bonfire of the Vanities. Though not initially started by Savonarola, he actively supported them. He loved the idea of them. Many, many works of art and historical records were burned on the grounds of being sinful. Among some of the more fervent followers was Sandro Botticelli, who ended up burning almost all of his artwork, and he was left with no disposable means of income. He led a life of poverty after this, having been so caught up in Savonarola and his sermons. You might recognize a few of his paintings, and maybe one in particular will stand out. Though he painted a few more items before his death, his career as a painter was largely over, unfortunately. Before much longer, Alexander had had enough of this. He excommunicated Savonarola and threatened interdiction, as well as sending papal forces to strike Florence as long as they harbored Savonarola. He saw the odds were against him and stepped down, but not before giving a final, angry, fiery speech, and nearing the end of it, though, he claimed to have been imbued with divine powers and could create miracles. A rival Franciscan monk said, "Hey, wait a minute, you're full of shit, buddy." And he called him on it. In fact, he said that if he was blessed, he would be able to survive what is known as a trial of fire. Basically, he would need to walk through fires of some sort or be burned at the stake and remain unharmed. This was the first trial of fire that had been performed here in decades, if not a century or two. The thing is, there was no backing down for Savonarola. It was all or nothing, so he accepted the challenge. But on the day of it, however, he stalled for hours and hours until a thunderstorm arrived and, well, it's raining, we can't have a burning, sorry guys. The public, on the other hand, they didn't take this too well. They either wanted miracles or burnings. Not much to do for fun in them days, you know. So they stormed San Marco, where Savonarola and his supporters were hunkered down. Savonarola and two of his immediate underlings were dragged out and thrown into jail, which led to Savonarola confessing that he lied about his powers and visions. But then he changed his mind. Then he actually changed it back again. Actually, no, he, past a point, he kind of just accepted things. We'll leave it at that. Not long after this imprisonment, the three were led out to undergo a tribunal consisting of clerics, priests, and bishops. Savonarola was branded a heretic, and the three were hung at separate gallows with bonfires lit directly beneath them. Though he was removed, Savonarola's fanaticism further removed Florence from its prime under Lorenzo, leaving the city in a poor state for decades to come. Florence was once the crown jewel of the Italian city-states, and after these events, there was no way it'd be reclaiming its former glory anytime soon.